My name's David Helvarg. I'm an author, executive director of Blue Frontier. We're an ocean conservation and policy group based out of Washington, D.C. and Richmond, California. And we just want to talk, I brought together a tremendous, we want to talk about the other 71%. And how it connects, and how the connection between soil and the ocean is not just negative, is not just, right now we're overfished, overheated ocean, we're polluted with oil and chemicals and plastics and nutrients that are running off into our seas. But we also have great opportunities. One of the panels yesterday talking about the regenerative ocean. And we've seen the resiliency of the ocean, which is tremendous. We've seen it here in Richmond. We've seen it in California. My last book, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea, is about how we can actually grow our solutions faster than our problems. And one of those solutions is the way we deal with our coast and ocean in California. We're 40 million people, we're the world's 6th largest economy, and we're doing good by our ocean. And then we have our Doppelganger states like Texas and Florida, which have allowed the oil industry and the developers and big ag to take over. And I was in Florida on election night, 9 months into algal bloom that had been poisoning large coastal areas of Florida. And I wrote that I was there election night when they voted to drown themselves. I didn't mean it literally, but I do have a problem with people who kind of reject NOAA scientists when they tell them that the climate is rapidly changing, but believe these same NOAA scientists when they say that there's a hurricane headed your way and you've got to evacuate. So we're going to talk about where the land and ocean intersect, and I'm honored that I was able to bring some of what I consider the leading people who are making those connections. Karina Nielsen is the director of the Romberg-Tiburon Center, which is really the marine lab for the Bay Area from San Francisco State University. Anna Cummins is a founder and strategic director for Gyres, which has identified all the global plastics and the great 5 gyres of our ocean planet, and also has done advocacy to do something about it, including passing a national law that helping to do things, and she can talk about that. And Vicky Vasquez is with the the Pacific Shark Research Center. I mean, you can't think about the ocean without the sharks. And California, we're very proud of our white sharks. Because if there's not something bigger and meaner than you out there, it's not really wilderness. And we have a beautiful Pacific wilderness here. And Jason Scorce is the director of the Center for Blue Economy, which is about the hundreds of billions of dollars of value we have by not drilling, by building a diverse ocean economy, which he'll discuss, and that's at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey. So they're going to briefly talk. We'll have some discussion, maybe some time to talk about how you see the soil and sea connection. But I'd like to start with Karina, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, David. Thanks for that introduction. I'm a scientist. I'm one of those people we don't believe so much anymore, I guess. Well, hopefully we do. I started out life as a marine ecologist, but if you go back even further, I started out as a chef. So I have a relationship to food as well as to science. But what's not always so apparent, I think, for people, even though the ocean covers 71% of the planet, is the connections between what we do on land and how that affects the ocean. I think people are pretty aware about the issues with overfishing. What's not so apparent is how we impact the ocean in more diffuse ways. The connections between the land and sea become kind of obvious if you see something like a pipe that's got runoff or sewage dumping into the ocean. We've certainly seen images like that, and that actually is probably a pretty vivid image, yet it's probably not among the most important ways in which we're impacting the oceans. How we actually produce our food on the land, what kind of food we produce, how much of it we produce, how we transport it, how we fertilize it, These things have a huge influence on our connections with the ocean through the land. The biogeochemical cycles that we're impacting result in the flow of nutrients and carbon from the land through our watersheds and through the atmosphere, the other solution that bathes the planet, and they eventually meet the sea in one way or another. From one, we think a lot in the ocean about one major nutrient because it tends to be the most limiting, and that's nitrogen. It's also not limiting in the atmosphere. It's the most abundant gas we have in the atmosphere, and we've been doing an incredible job of pulling it out of the atmosphere, fixing it, and applying it to the landscape, and a lot of that ends up in the ocean. The other big problem that we've had recently, of course, is climate change and the combustion of fossil fuels. And from that process, we're grabbing all the carbon that's stored in the soils and in the earth and combusting it and releasing it up into the atmosphere. And that, in turn, is bathing the planet, overlaying the ocean. And in fact, the ocean has absorbed about 30% or so of the fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide we've released in the atmosphere from burning, combusting fossil fuels. So through these two huge processes by which we're impacting biogeochemical cycles that are not necessarily as vivid or as visible as a pipe dumping pollution into the water, we are having a dramatic impact on the oceans. Nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon dioxide and light, of course, are also the essential elements that make the ocean grow, if you will. It's the base of the food chain. It's the base of the food chain on the planet. It's the basis by which photosynthesis converts those things into plant matter. And they're important in all our ecosystems. And of course, the animals that consume these then are engaged in transforming these materials and returning them to the soil and the water and the atmosphere. So we too are part of this large cycle. But globally, we have made huge impacts on these cycles. We have dramatically increased the movement of phosphorus, one of these important nutrients, from the land into the ocean by a factor of at least 3. We've had an even more dramatic impact on the flow of nitrogen from the atmosphere through the landscape into the oceans, upwards of tenfold in some cases and in some places. And it's especially dramatic in areas of high human population. And of course, as I mentioned before, about 30% of the carbon dioxide we've released from the earth through combustion of fossil fuels has been absorbed by the oceans, which has other implications for the ocean. So, as I said, those point sources of flowing in are probably not the biggest problem, even though they may be the most obvious. We can actually manage those reasonably well, and we have some solutions for those. It's the larger watersheds, and especially the watersheds that host a lot of agricultural activity and atmospheric nitrogen pollution that are the hardest to manage and to control. Most of the nitrogen, for example, that's being delivered into the Mississippi is coming from fossil fuel combustion and animal feeding operations that end up delivering a lot of nitrogen into that watershed. And that deposition can be either directly or by the runoff from the land. So the production, obviously, of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer has been responsible for the largest change in the global nitrogen cycle, converting it from the atmospheric form into a form that the crops end up using, obviously. We are now using and putting into converting and fixing about 110 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Over half of the inorganic nitrogen that we've ever used on Earth has been applied during about the last 30 years. And if you want to know approximately how much that is, just to imagine how much that is, 1 teragram is about 1 million metric tons. And a blue whale weighs more or less 200 tons. And that would give you about 500,000 blue whales. We don't have anywhere near 500,000 blue whales in the ocean. So that is an awful lot of inputs. The watersheds carry this nitrogen to our estuaries and coastal waters, and it can have a major impact. Many of you have probably heard of the effects of eutrophication. Nitrogen ends up fertilizing these waterways, the estuaries that are near us. They produce enormous phytoplankton blooms, often in response. And as those phytoplankton blooms decay, the microbes consume them, and they put in lots of carbon dioxide and pull the oxygen down, and we get these huge dead zones. This year, in the Gulf of Mexico, we had one of the largest dead zones occurring that has happened in over 30 years. It's about the size of New Jersey. And it impacts obviously it suffocates a lot of marine life, and we have losses of shrimp and other fisheries that often would do much better in the absence of that pollution. One of the ways in which we can actually start combating some of this and in fact use nature to help us solve these is to restore our estuaries, to restore some of the nitrogen capturing capacity of wetlands. And in fact, this also will help us with carbon capture. So some of the things we've been doing in the Bay Area now about using nature-based adaptation and restoration techniques are not only going to help us with some of the issues that we have with capturing nitrogen, but also with reducing the impacts of carbon pollution. So on that note, I think I'll end and pass it along to our next speaker. Anna.
Good afternoon. Do I need to do anything here? Good afternoon. My name is Anna Cummins. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. You've all eaten lunch now, so I get to talk trash. I'm especially excited to be here. Most of the conferences I go to, I'm surrounded by ocean people. I'm sure we're all in the same boat, no pun intended. So it's nice to have my feet back on the ground. And this is a topic that I'm really excited about. Since I first learned about compost when I was 14, this is really what sparked my interest in all things sustainability. I was so enamored of compost that my first boyfriend in high school courted me by leaving a moldy peach on my doorstep, knowing that I would love watching the fuzz take it over. So I feel safe sharing that story here. For the last 10 years, though, I have been deeply immersed in a much darker form of waste, and that is plastic pollution. Our organization, Gyres, has sailed over 60,000 miles across the world's oceans doing scientific research. I have seen firsthand what the last 60 years of our disposable society has done to the entire planet, including some of the most remote places on Earth, our entire food chain, and even our own bodies. And if I could sum up all these experiences in a single word, it's a word that we've heard over the last few days, and that is accountability. How can we hold big plastic, which is really big oil, accountable for a planet fouled with plastic pollution? Now, the plastics industry has historically blamed we, the people, for littering. Instead of taking responsibility for the end life, they tried to reframe this as a behavior problem. Meanwhile, they are relentlessly and quietly producing millions of tons of single-use, non-recyclable toxic plastics. And it's impossible for me to look at this photo, my hometown of Los Angeles, the beach in Santa Monica, and not see a design failure. When you look at this photo, it's mostly single-use objects, packaging made from fossil fuels, highly toxic, that we use for moments, but that are designed to last indefinitely. So how did we get here to this point today where we have literally covered 21% of our planet's surface with a smog of plastic pollution? Now, it really started here back in the 40s and the 50s when we were sold this American dream of prosperity through endless consumerism. I love this photo. This was the cover of Life magazine in 1955. The article was titled "Throw Away Living." And this is when we celebrated the advent of plastics. They're cheap, they're lightweight, and sign of the times, they would save housewives from the chores of doing the dishes. We could just throw it all away. Well, of course, 60 years later, we are seeing the global impacts of this. And you don't need to walk far. In fact, I just walked out to the front steps of this auditorium, and bam, there it is. Plastic packaging, straws, bags, bottles, you name it. And I'm going to talk about the marine impacts, but I do want to point out that there is a justice issue inherent in this as well. We in the global north, the recycling that we collect in the global north, most of it we ship overseas to China, to Vietnam, to India, to places that don't yet have adequate waste management infrastructure, and where communities are literally living on and amongst our waste. And this is how plastic gets into the ocean. We talk about the land-sea connection. Roughly 80% of the plastics we find out in the oceans starts here on land. It's as simple as this plastic straw. Every stream, watershed, river, and unfortunately storm drain is a connection between land and sea. And just as it washes pesticides, which we've been talking about a lot, into our oceans, it's also washing plastic waste. And once this plastic gets out into the oceans, it gets swept up into these massive oceanic current systems called gyres. There are 5 major gyres in the world. It's a natural phenomenon, but this is where plastic made from petrochemicals is fragmenting and accumulating, but it never really goes away. Now, what impact does this have on marine wildlife? Devastating impact. Devastating impact on marine wildlife through entanglement. The bigger stuff can trap turtles and dolphins and all kinds of species, but also ingestion. There's also a human health impact here, since some of us maybe don't care about turtles, but we do care about our own bodies, and that's how plastic is getting into the food chain. Now, we know that plastic particles in the ocean act like sponges for contaminants. Things like PCBs, DDT, chemicals that are endocrine disruptors linked to all kinds of issues, stick to plastic like a sponge. And the science is now going smaller and smaller and smaller. A single grain of plastic the size of a lentil can have up to 1 million times higher concentration of these contaminants. But we're now finding microplastics and nanoparticles of plastic in the bodies of zooplankton, in the circulatory systems of oysters and mussels or mustards, mussels and other bivalves. We're also seeing microplastics in everyday consumer products, drinking water, honey, sea salt, God forbid beer, and also in many of the fish that people eat today. This is a fish that my husband caught while drifting from Los Angeles to Hawaii on a boat we made from 15,000 plastic bottles and a bunch of junk called junk raft. And as he went to fish this fish out and eat it, he cut open the stomach and found 17 pieces of plastic inside. Which brings up the question, as these contaminant-laden plastics are entering the food chain, are we becoming plasticized? Now, we've heard some pretty devastating stories about how some of our most vulnerable communities are impacted by pesticides in agricultural fields. I want to share my own personal story just to give an idea of today's baseline. In 2009, before having a child, we did a body burden study on me and found trace levels in my blood serum of PCBs, DDT, PFCs, and flame retardants. And if any one of us in this room did the same study, we would find something similar. This is an absolutely unaccountable failure, unacceptable failure in accountability. So I want to end on a positive note, an example of how we can use science to drive accountability. We went into the Great Lakes in 2012 to try and link this to inland communities. And what we found in the Great Lakes was more plastic by count than any of the oceans we had surveyed. And the slide I skipped over was we have found 5.25 trillion particles weighing 269,000 metric tons. But in the Great Lakes, we found more plastic by count in Lake Erie, and it turned out the source of that were microplastics, microbeads, and personal care products. So we were able to use that science to drive accountability. We banded together with a bunch of our partners, with NRDC, Story of Stuff, Surfrider Foundation, on, to pass a bill in California, which then provided the momentum for a federal bill to ban the sale of products that contain microbeads, and that will go into effect this year. Now, there's... This, to me, is an example of the power of collaboration, of what we can do when we really band together. And my hope today is that we can create more alliances between land and sea, because we all have the same goal here, and that is to end our dependence on fossil fuels. Es un ejemplo de lo que podemos hacer cuando trabajamos juntos. Muchísimas gracias.
Hi there, my name is Vicky, and I am a graduate student at Moss Landing Marine Labs, and I am also their social media manager. And I'm also the deputy director of a group called the Ocean Research Foundation. And most recently, I was also on Shark Week. So you might be wondering, why do you have a Shark Week scientist talking to you at this conference? Well, for what I was doing in Shark Week, I was looking at new deep sea species of sharks. And that might sound like a very far away voyage, and it wasn't. It took about 10 minutes of a boat ride, because the deep sea canyon off of where we were working was right next to the coastline. And this is incredibly similar to where I am in Moss Landing Marine Labs. Moss Landing Marine Labs sits right at the deep sea canyon of Monterey. And then right in front of that, if any of you guys are familiar with the area, is a lot of agriculture. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit today is how agriculture has actually been connected to the work at my lab, as well as sharks, which may not seem like a straightforward connection. So the first thing I wanted to point out was a really, really interesting group that we have at Moss Landing Marine Labs, and this is the Central Coast Wetlands Group. They're doing a fascinating project right now using the whole bioreactor technology concept. And so basically what that is an open air laboratory. And what they started with was this. Basically nothing. What you can kind of see in the background, oh great, is some of the agricultural land of Castro Valley. And what they wanted to do is figure out how they could help filter and clean this agricultural water, because as I'm sure many of you are aware, that used to be the jobs of wetlands, and we are constantly losing wetlands. We are losing these natural ways to clean this water. So this is what they started with. And as you can see, they had to do a lot of work. They had to get tractors, they had to dig, they even had to get like different water sources. And slowly it started to turn into this. And so what you're seeing is that open air laboratory I was talking about. So what they're currently doing right now is they're having that agricultural water filter through these systems, and they're trying to figure out which one of these systems works best. And so they have wood chips, they have alfalfa, they have controls, and what they are then doing is having this go through a wetland. Now I just want to quickly show you guys the that other picture again. Just as a reminder, there's no wetland around this. It was just dirt, and they slowly built, and you can kind of see there's more land around it. And the last thing I want to show you is a short video, an aerial, that you can see how what used to look like just dirt is now not only a test system for the water, but also a natural wetland behind it. And they're slowly testing to see how the water gets cleaner and cleaner through these different systems. So let me see if I can play this. It might work better to play it from... Great, thank you. So as you can see, pretty short. So that's one half of what Moss Landing Marine Labs has been doing to study how to better clean this water. But the part that I work with a lot more is the ecosystems. And so the next thing I wanted to show you, which is right next to this area, is Elkhorn Slough. So right down here, it's just out of sight of the picture, is Moss Landing Marine Labs. And one of the things that happened in this area was not only all the agricultural work that has shifted and changed this land over time, but also a harbor. And so what that harbor meant is they needed an opening. That was created. That is man-made right there. And so as you can imagine, what this did was flooded the rest of this area with a lot more water than it would have naturally had. And what some papers have written about this area is that this should actually be a dry valley. So sediments should have been over time slowly filling this in so that this waterway is no longer there. And so what's interesting, though, is that these are some of the animals that live in that slough. And so it's really weird to talk about an anthropogenic influence that has arguably had a positive influence for the elasmobranchs that you see behind me. Elasmobranchs are not only sharks, but they're also their cousins, the rays, which is why I have some pictures of other animals. So we see here, this is a bat ray. Over here is a brown smooth hound. To the lower end is a thornback ray, and then over here is a leopard shark. Now, when I say it's a positive story, what I mean by that is, hey, there's sharks there and they probably weren't going to be there before and it looked like it was going to dry up. But is that completely true and a completely positive story? I'm not really sure. What we do know is that this area used to be much more bountiful with brown smoothhound sharks, and the research that one of my lab mates is currently doing is showing that there seems to be now a bigger switch to thornback rays. So what we might be seeing is that as we have different influences in these areas, we are changing the composition of the animals there. There's also been some guitarfish, not as frequent. And then I just wanted to end with a photo of my lab mate. That is how she was collecting her field work, not simply on the boat, but actually in the water. It's a little hard to see, but that is her there with a leopard shark, collecting data and then releasing it. So if you guys would like to have any questions related to how these animals are using these coastal ways as they are constantly changing, that is what part of my lab is looking for. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Scorce, and I'm with the Center for the Blue Economy. And I study big economic trends and big data and all that, but I'm not going to talk about that as much today, but talk about something a little bit more directly related to you all. And I consider myself a pretty hardcore foodie, so I feel like I'm in the right tribe here and amongst kin, so it's good to be here. And I'm going to also focus on something where I think we have a lot more potential for personal empowerment and actually making change. So what I'm going to talk about isn't really require big national legislation or big movements, although I will mention a couple directions on that. And so the two biggest things, or the biggest thing that is impacting the ocean right now, is climate change. So that's the big threat. And it's obviously more than just the oceans that are at threat, but that's the big threat. And there are two paradigms that need to change in order for us to address climate change and actually have a chance at a prosperous, livable future by the end of this century. We spend a lot of time focusing on slow, okay. I'm a New Yorker, I talk fast. All right, so I'll try here. We've been focusing a lot on renewable energy, and that's been incredible, as many of you probably in this room probably have your own solar or even drive an electric car, and we can talk about that. That's an incredible revolution. The other revolution, though, is going to be required is a change in the food system. So most people don't realize that, especially in a lay audience, that we could have 100% renewable energy, but if the diets of 50 years from now are the diets of today, we will still not solve climate change, and we will still not have a livable future. And so the big paradigm shift that needs to happen is a movement away from animal-based products as the predominant diet. I'm glad. Well, I knew I was among friends. And I actually was really happy because I go to all these environmental conferences, and I go out and the lunch is roast beef, red-listed fish, plastics, you know, and styrofoam, and I'm going, how can people talk about this stuff all day and then go and not live it, right? So I was really happy to see you all walking the walk, because I know I'm talking to people who get it. And so what I want to say here is that all the fights for organic agriculture, anti-GMO stuff are incredibly important, but really this simple movement down the food chain is really, I would say, orders of magnitude more important than all the rest. And again, not to try to create a hierarchy here, but just in terms of prioritization. And we can get into maybe in the Q&A, I'm writing a couple articles on this, all the other amazing health and political benefits that will come from a world in which the United States is not so unhealthy and spending hundreds of billions of dollars on preventable illness. But linking it to the oceans, this is the key thing, right? If we can move away from a diet based on animal products and dairy as the dominant source of protein, the oceans will be the biggest beneficiaries. In addition, the seafood is a big issue. Just to point this out, so if I was to say, that I ate a tiger or a gorilla for dinner last night, most of you would be aghast, because you would think, even though ethically it's not really that much different in terms of pain or sentience than eating a pig or a cow, you know that tigers and gorillas are very endangered species and they're very important in our ecosystems. It turns out that eating a bluefin tuna or a swordfish is actually worse ecologically than eating a tiger or a gorilla. We just haven't, because the oceans is kind of this out of sight, out of mind, and fish are these things kind of like reptiles that are thought of as weird and not as charismatic as a tiger or a gorilla. But from an ecological standpoint, from an endangered species standpoint, eating bluefin tuna for sushi is worse than eating a tiger for steak. And so I have a friend, I don't have his slide up here, but a friend of mine who is in New York. He just launched, he's an investor in a new product. It's going to be available in Whole Foods starting in October. It's called Ahimi, and it's Ocean Hugger Foods, and it is a plant-based, tomato-based tuna substitute that has been developed by master chefs, and it is being met with rave reviews. And so this is the future, right? So you all who are in the food movement, the introduction and the movement towards plant-based foods to take substitute away from the tuna and the swordfish and the meat and the dairy. I'm not saying everyone's got to become vegan overnight, but this is where the investment's going. Silicon Valley's putting the big money in it. This is where all the big food companies see it. They're so scared that they're actually trying to get the USDA and the FDA to say that, non-dairy milks aren't real milk, and they're fighting against things because they're losing this battle. And so I just want all of you in the food movement to know that this is as important as solar panels, as wind farms, but changing the food system is something that's more trophically appropriate for 10 billion people and more ethical. So on that, thank you.
Obviously, all of these folks could go on a lot, but we wanted to open up some time. I already don't eat bluefin tuna, but after what you said, I'll stop eating tiger as well. Actually, at Blue Frontier, we decided some years ago to stop serving sustainable seafood and serve gourmet vegetarian and vegan. Not basically just because I got tired of all the other ocean groups serving sustainable seafood, where, it's like I go to forest conferences and the forest conservationists don't open up with a big bonfire. So I think we've got, what we try to do mainly at Blue Frontiers is, get people to school together. So all of my friends and colleagues are part of this movement. Like with your movement, we know what the solutions are. As I said on the opening night, number 12 on the 50 ways to save the ocean is eat more organic and vegetarian. And then I talk about local sourcing. But beyond that, number 1 is go to the beach, because you protect what you love. And obviously people love fertile soils and they love wildness, and our oceans are still incredibly wild, although incredibly at risk. So I thought what I'd do, and as I say, we know what the solutions are, and we need movements to generate those solutions. We need to go to the political will. We've lobbied successfully on bills against microplastics. We had a lobby and we stopped pirate fishing. We haven't stopped it, but at least we have the tools of enforcement. We had, at our last Blue Vision Summit, the largest citizen lobby for the oceans up on Capitol Hill, 25 states, including the Inland Ocean Coalition from Colorado and Utah and Arizona and Michigan and Vermont, because every state's a coastal state. We all love not only to dive and body surf and commune, but also to breathe. And those other plants, the phytoplankton, are letting us breathe. So since I don't have enough opportunities with my friends and colleagues, I thought I'd do one or two questions here, and then we'd open it up until Miguel kicks us off the stage. First, a lot of the soil not all theme is that healthy soils are great carbon sequesterers. And I'd like to ask you about the greatest carbon sequestering plants, and maybe start with Karina and anyone else.
The greatest carbon sequestering plants? Seaweeds, kelp, seagrasses actually are another, salt marshes, actually the marine soils, if you will, the peats that develop in salt marshes, those are great carbon sequestration tools under some circumstances. As a matter of fact, in California, which is pretty interesting, there was a bill passed not too long ago about promoting the restoration of eelgrass specifically for this purpose, to help us sequester more carbon and sweeten the water so that it's less acidic. Because as I think most of you probably know, the dissolution of carbon dioxide into the water, that absorption that I was talking about before, causes ocean acidification. And a lot of our shellfish don't do so well. They don't grow well. They can't form their shells well when the waters are very acidified. So carbon sequestration in the ocean is really important. There are other ways. People have talked about biogeoengineering, which I think is a little dangerous, but people have talked about taking phytoplankton, which produce, say, 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere, but are, fixing carbon in that process, and trying to enhance what we call the biological pump, which is to push them down into storage in the deep, deep ocean. And there are some crazy experiments going on with fertilizing the oceans with iron and stuff like that that are really need a little more thoughtful approach and care. Some of those are happening in high seas, in the high seas that are unregulated, or they're being done by duping, engagement by people who don't realize the problems they may cause. So there are some pros and cons to the blue carbon markets, if you will, and we need to use science to sort of figure out what the best approaches are.
And John and Dan yesterday had a good panel on the kelp farming down in Goleta and growing out. Kelp farming is both a great source for cosmetics, food, foamier beer heads. But I just want to say we were having dinner with Karina and Kathy, who's the eelgrass expert at her lab, who was complaining that this bill had been introduced and the science of, wasn't up to speed. If we can actually do eelgrass restoration, they'd be counted as carbon offsets. And I just had to point out to Kathy that we're living in a state where we actually have politicians who introduce eelgrass legislation. So, what you need is when the science becomes policy, you're in a good situation.
I guess I was just going to say that there's so many good reasons to restore eelgrass that it almost doesn't matter. It's a win-win. There's no downside to doing that. So anyway.
Does anyone have questions? We should open it up, continue the conversation, join the Sea Party. The ocean's rising, and so are we. We're figuring the ocean movement has reached the point where we can join women and science and climate, and we're going to have a March for the Ocean next June 8th, which is World Ocean Day. And it's only going to succeed if we link it to all the other movements that represent we the people. First question.
Yeah, perhaps the biggest elephant in the room would be Fukushima for the oceans. And I don't know if you can talk about that. I've heard how devastating it is to the sea creatures, to seafood, to ocean products such as kelp. So maybe you can address the status, what's being done, and how we can help.
I really appreciate you bringing that up because it's a really great example of how science can get miscommunicated. I know that when you look especially on social media, there often have been these very convincing but unfortunately very misleading connections from Fukushima. And so basically what happens is in social media, scary things happen and sad things happen. A really great example is the recent die-off of sharks in San Francisco Bay. And right around this time, there's also been at least 2 deaths of great white sharks. And this was also linked to Fukushima. However, that was not an issue. There have been scientists, especially from my lab, who have used the radiation from Fukushima as markers. They've also used the radiation from Fukushima as markers for bluefin tuna, and they use these as markers for migration. And so what that means is that the amount of radiation in these animals was so small and negligible in terms of what you're eating, but important in terms of understanding how quickly they moved. Now, I know that doesn't sound very comforting, but there are other natural levels of radiation that I think probably other people can speak to a little bit better than myself, that are also, that are equal to the amount that we're seeing in California. So
I guess I would just say, of course, there are localized effects, and it's sort of similar with a lot of pollutants. There can often be really strong localized effects, but often they don't carry as far as people believe they may. And that is really the case with Fukushima. There was a lot of monitoring of kelp, actually. The seaweed growers were and harvesters were very concerned about that because they tend to take it up quite readily, and there was a big monitoring program, and there was a small signal initially, and it has completely dissipated. So for all intents and purposes on the California coast at this point in time, there isn't a big worry about the radiation from Fukushima.
I'd also say one more thing. If you're interested in looking at more of a point explanation, I'd highly recommend checking out a paper by Andrew Thaler. It was a blog post on a blog called Southern Fried Science, and he mentions a lot of the key things that you may have heard online, and he helps dispute them.
And also somebody who worked as an investigative journalist for 30 years, this is also a reflection on the changing nature of our media. Most of the original images we saw, like NOAA current maps that were portrayed on social media as maps of radiation emanating from Japan, were put out on survivalist websites. And actually a lot of environmentalists spent a lot of time refuting, but it was clickbait, because a lot of survivalists who push out environmental dangers that aren't the actual environmental threats can make a lot of money that way. And this is how we distinguish fake news from source-based investigative journalism.
Hi. I know that PG&E's Moss Landing electrical plant generates so much pollution that they have to repaint boats in the harbor and give free covers for the sails and so on. And I just wonder, I'm not sure about El Segundo or San Pedro or other places up and down the coast, how much acidification is coming just from these electrical plants and other, secondary sort of things. Like, that's right next to the Monterey, National Park or whatever, Marine Park. And how much is that changing the water there?
Well, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does equilibrate pretty quickly with the ocean waters, and there are certainly localized impacts, but that's actually something we don't know a ton about. And I was just talking with a colleague the other day about the impacts of sort of dirty air as you leave the coastline and go out into the ocean. There's certainly an impact. It's sort of an area of ongoing study. So presumably there is some localized effect, but really the massive effect is coming from the global burning of fossil fuels, more so than the local.
I'd say.
And also, just in terms of our sanctuaries, I mean, one thing we know for sure is we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Best available science says we need to leave 70% of the known reserves of oil under the seabed. And so right now we just got 850,000 public comments against the Trump administration's attempts to actually shrink California's 4 marine sanctuaries, including Monterey, negate their expansions, and they've been very upfront about it. They want to open up all our offshore waters for new offshore oil drilling.
I was just going to say quickly with the ocean acidification, we actually had a paper recently come out about juvenile rockfish with Dr. Scott Hamilton at Moss Landing Marine Labs. And so we do have people studying ocean acidification, but they're looking at the bigger scale because, to my knowledge, what might be specifically happening in Moss Landing is not the primary focus of interest, or where we're seeing the biggest and most serious impacts. And then We also have agricultural with a seaweed going on, and so we are looking, well, not me, I'm a shark person, but the seaweed person, Dr. Mike Graham at our lab, is also looking at ways to use seaweed locally, naturally, as a new food source. And in terms of, again, talking about things like Fukushima or other things that might be contaminating it, obviously if this was a serious concern, that would not be a new entrepreneurial pursuit for him.
Yeah, and it's just, this is the future in terms of good protein, sea veggies, and shellfish. And at this point, we talked some of the panels yesterday, places like Hog Island Oysters and Taylor Shellfish Company in the Pacific Northwest are not only producing healthy seafood, but they also, those shellfish industries becoming the indicator species for ocean acidification, because we're also seeing already the spats, the baby oyster shells, being deformed by OA.
Okay, my question is probably mostly for Karina. I'm going to start out with something positive so that we don't all get so depressed we can't do anything. I've been working for years to get our local sanitary district to give recycled water to urban farmers, and use their buffer land for an urban farm, which they've given us 15 acres for $1 a year and all the recycled water we can use. So that's the positive thing. Take that hose and turn it around back onto the land and grow things in the cities. But now I'm going to ask you the negative part, which is there's still 1 trillion gallons of recycled tertiary grade water going into the Bay Area waterways every year. And just to give everybody an idea how much that is, the shortfall in the Central Valley was 2.1 trillion. We threw half of that away. So what impact is that having? What work is being done to use that water? Talk about recycled water a little bit, please.
Yeah, I'll have to say that's not my primary area of expertise, so I might not have the answers that you're looking for, but I did want to echo the fact that we actually do know what to do about a lot of the problems that are occurring. You gave one example just in the preamble to your question. We talked about restoring wetlands. We talked about restoring eelgrass. We've talked about some of these cultivating seaweeds, and in fact, I believe that the aquaculture of seaweed that Mike Graham is involved in actually takes the carbon dioxide from that power plant and pumps it into the water so that it's taking it up. So there are a lot of opportunities like this, and I am sure there are many more with the recycling of the water, and I'm just sorry that it's just not something I know enough about to speak to.
Just so you know, it's high in nitrogen and phosphorus.
Oh, yeah, no, I know that.
So it's great for agriculture.
Yeah.
Just that
We should be
the
doing more.
agriculture is out in the Central Valley and the recycled water is in the urban centers. So we need more urban farming, obviously.
Yeah.
So that's for sure. We need more urban farming. Thank you. Okay. So the positive thing that I can start with is that knowledge is positive power, so that we can make the best, most life-enhancing choices. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned the nanoparticle contamination, the plastic nanoparticle contamination, especially of sea salt, because most people are totally unaware of that. And there are so many products, food products on the shelves now, which would be excellent otherwise, but everybody is using sea salt. So thank you for that information, for stating that information. And of course, letting go of fossil fuels is a given. Perhaps, though, also letting go to a degree of our wanting, quote unquote, energy at all. Because, well, I've recently learned about the massive areas that China and Europe and probably people from our country are covering the ocean with solar panels. And I'm wondering if you know about that already. And everything is connected, so that means that these massive areas, which will increase if we, if it's still a good business opportunity, what impact they're having in terms of light, in terms of heat, changing the quality of life underneath them. Thank you.
So to the first point, I know it was more of a statement, but I just did want to point out that we have since, in the last few years, discovered that the largest single contributor of microplastics to our oceans and to our waters is through the washing of synthetic clothing. That's a tough one to wrap your head around because there's not easy solutions quite yet, but there's a lot of R&D happening on that now. And again, the solution to so much of this stuff is local communities, urban gardening, growing your own and avoiding excess packaging, but we have a long ways to go on that. To the second point.
Yeah, I would just say, in terms of the area that's needed for renewable energy, for solar and wind, they're not so great that they would have devastating ecological impacts. And again, everything's relative. One thing I want to just be clear, and I know you all know this, but it's just, there is no zero impact living, okay, right? Life begets life, energy displaces energy. It's the quantity and how you do it. And so a solar can have a pretty low footprint for 10 billion people relative, and it's way better than climate change.
My question is about California agriculture and the wine industry in particular. People always talk about the Mississippi River and the nitrogen problems there, but there's been actually not a lot of reporting lately about California and the agricultural impact on the oceans. We know we have water shortages, but we don't talk much about the impact of the industries that grow all these crops. I'm particularly focused on the wine industry. So I write about organic and biodynamically grown wines. There's been very little awareness or reporting about anything anti-wine industry. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about the impacts of the wine industry on the oceans.
I can't speak specifically to the wine industry. I can speak about water and agriculture. And as an economist, the key thing in California agriculture is the water subsidies, right? I mean, and so it's a very complicated system, but I was actually part of a couple big lawsuits that were, trying to get water back for rivers because a lot of these Central Valley farmers in particular have been violating the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act for 4 decades. But that's really the key. The key is the subsidies and paying the true cost of the water. The irony is the one big thing environmentalists are really worried about now is actually going to be the marijuana industry. And they're actually huge areas of the North Coast where they're literally just taking every drop of water out of streams to grow weed. And as much as I love weed, they shouldn't do it like that. So there's going to be big things there. So it went from grapes to now marijuana is going to be the big culprit. That's what we're going to focus on. Yeah.
Thank you guys very much for this great panel. Last biennials, there was this guy talking about harvesting seaweed and clams and mussels, so sort of aquaculture, but on a mass level in our seas, zero inputs. And it seems that if we were able to get the California Coastal Commission to okay this and start having our food come in a large part in mass from our oceans, but not necessarily from a fish form, but from seaweed, kelp, etc. We could take care of the meat problem. We could get thousands and thousands of families involved as protectors of our oceans for when they try to open up our oceans to drilling again. And so the mass would already be there as, ocean protectors, while also cutting down on the fossil fuel problems and CO2 problems.
Yeah, there was an amazing panel about that yesterday. You need to find the gentleman, and also John from Nutiva was involved in that.
And that would have been Bren Smith, who's East Coast equivalent, who spoke at Pioneers. The reality is yes, California is very difficult. We have had very bad experiences with offshore oil, which is why there's, instead of a NIMBY, I'd say a NOBO, a not on my bay or ocean attitude towards R&D offshore. But on the other hand, it's, and my friend, the late Peter Douglas, who ran the Coastal Commission, said, the coast is never saved, it's always being saved. So there's always, and I think it's a positive, there's always a huge amount of caution along the coast because every Californian has a sense of entitlement. They understand that the coast and the ocean belongs to all of us. But there is huge potential in beginning to do the R&D in looking at shellfish and different forms of algae and sea vegetables. I mean, what's happened historically is we've fished down the trophic levels. You know, big finfish and tuna used to be the big dollar catches in California 80, 70, 60 years ago. Now it's sea urchins and but it wasn't an intentional. It wasn't we're going down the trophic level because we know that's where it's healthier to eat. So now it's sort of the mind change of moving in that right direction.
I would just add a couple of comments. You know, the balance between, we haven't been very good about looking at sustainable aquaculture, if you will, or mariculture, and the permitting around that is very challenging. But the principle of eating lower on the food chain and eating seaweeds and eating shellfish will have a massive carbon impact in the positive direction. Yeah, so.
And also because California has this history, we have our largest commercial fishing group, the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, also very attuned to the idea of more sustainable, more local. With the return of sardine to a small degree in Monterey Bay, late Zeke Grader and his follower now talked about you don't want to smash up these forage fish and turn them into fish meal for chickens and farmed fish. You want to work with Alice Water, work with the people, the foodies, and develop Mediterranean. We're Mediterranean climate. You know, eat the sardines and with lots of plant-based calories, and it's delicious. And it's even, you know, I'm not at that level yet. I'm still, you know, I'll eat any fish that still has a fighting chance, which unfortunately is fewer between. But I'll catch a salmon in California because it's it's got this heroic Homeric journey. It's a heroic fish and also a delicious fish, and it's also a symbol of our commitment to keeping our waters clean. If you don't have clean waters and rivers, and if groups like commercial fish don't connect, commercial fishing groups like PCFFA don't connect with the scientists and the environmentalists and the ranchers and everyone working together, when we do work together, we get good results. And
yeah, although there is one worry, and that is the state of the, you know, we've had a hard time growing natural kelp on the North Coast for the past 2 years. But for many of you may know that already. If you're abalone divers, it's been slim pickings. And a colleague of mine who does North Coast abalone surveys for Fish and Wildlife, I was just talking with her the other day, and she says it's like abalone graveyards out there because there hasn't been enough kelp. So it's just kind of some challenges we face.
And a lot of the kelp have gone away because of hot water, and we can do all the right things in California, but it's other people's choices in energy and pollution still impact us. We have to grow our movement. We can't be just local. And I guess one more question.
Yes. Yeah. One more question.
Can you speak to the dangers of pen farm fishing? Recently in Bellingham, Washington, we had a collapse of a farm and many deformed Atlantic salmon
the Atlantic
released.
Salmon, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the movement of non-native species around to different areas is challenging. That's very unfortunate. It'll be, I guess, interesting to see what happens as a result of that. But fish farming is one of those things that has some challenges and some benefits, depending on how it's done, right? Double-edged sword sometimes. The most important thing, though, probably, is that we can develop solutions. We can be thoughtful about how we do them, but we need to push ourselves and our politicians to make good choices for us. We need to do the right thing by the oceans and by the environment, and I think this group is probably the best one to start working on those things together.
Absolutely. I think the ocean community is growing. We're the next wave of resistance. We want to link up with the people who are doing right by the land. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
I have one more.
Oh, we're allowed one more? Great.
Yeah,
one more question.
Thanks. I had a question for you, and I'm sorry I don't remember your name. Hi.
Jason.
So you mentioned something about synthetic tuna using heme. Is that what I heard you say?
No, not synthetic. It's called ahimi. It's the name. It's Ocean Hugger Foods. It's made out of algae and tomatoes. and it's not a genetically modified
Okay, so
thing
it's
at all.
AHIMI.
AHIMI,
Never heard of it before.
AHIMI, Ocean Hugger Foods. It will be available in Whole Foods next month.
AHIMI. Okay, thank you very much.
I know we're out of time, but I wanted to just reiterate something that David said. June 8th next year is World Oceans Day. We need to get beyond the usual suspects of just the ocean groups. We really need a land-sea alliance. So we'd love for everyone to mark your calendars, look for more information. We can work with the Soil Not Oil Coalition to really gather everyone, because as we know, it's one planet, one ocean, and we are linked together. June 8th, March for the Ocean.
Here, here.
And just want to thank once more Vicky and Karina and Anna and Jason, and I'll be at the book table signing books, and they'll be available to speak with you all.
It's just one comment, and I had heard recently that the little fish in San Francisco Bay have 10 times more PCBs than the big fish, and we were supposed to be eating low on the food chain. So I just wanted to tell you, I'm not asking you to comment, it's too late, but you start thinking about what's around the Bay, and just in Berkeley, we've got UC, Bayer, and we've got these telecommunications and all the tech, and that's where the PCBs are coming from, and so cheerio.